we can't control the trade policy of the United States. We recognize that that policy has fundamentally changed from the policy in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s.
Just when it seems that economic policy cannot become any more unpredictable, a new decision emerges from Washington. President Donald Trump announces the introduction of a 10% tariff on goods from Canada. It would seem to be just a number minus 10%, but behind this figure lies much more than just an import tax. It is a signal that the US is opening a new front not against an enemy, but against its closest ally.
On specific transactions, specific sectors, steel, aluminum, and energy, and a lot of progress has been made. And we stand ready.
The reason, it would seem, was a trifle a dispute that flared up after a political advertisement comparing Trump to Ronald Reagan. But this is not just a dispute over reputation. It is a symbolic clash between two eras, when America built bridges and when it now builds walls. Since Trump came to power, trade wars have become part of his image. China, Europe, Mexico, now it's Canada's turn. The same Canada that has been the United States' most reliable partner for decades. Their economies are intertwined, their businesses depend on each other, and their border is one of the most peaceful on the planet. But the new tariff threatens this fragile balance.
Well, here's a little bit of that ad that so enraged the president.
For Americans, this decision may turn out to be a defeat rather than a victory. Analysts are already warning that aluminum, construction materials, and food products will become more expensive. What used to cost $1 will now cost $1.10. And those 10 cents are not just a difference in price, they are the price of political ambition. Canada is preparing a response, and it could be painful. Symmetrical tariffs on American goods, reduced purchases from the US, and the search for new markets in Asia and Europe. Each of these decisions is a blow to American jobs, farmers, factories, and companies that cannot afford to wait for politics to change again.
Now, Donald Trump has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with Canada because of an advert that criticizes his tariffs.
It is no coincidence that many people remember Reagan. In the 1980s, he understood that America's economic power was based on trust. Trust in its word, in its partnership, in its market. Today, that trust is being destroyed step by step, tariff by tariff. And now the world is watching as the US transforms from a pillar of the global economy into a source of instability. Americans are accustomed to believing that tariffs protect their workers. But what if they are actually hurting them? What if the promised protection turns into price increases, layoffs, and a loss of confidence in the dollar?
And it's a situation where the United States has tariffs against every one of their trading partners to different degrees. And it's in that context that our officials, my colleagues, have been working with their American colleagues on detailed, constructive negotiations, discussions.
The decision on tariffs against Canada may seem like a minor episode in a long series of trade conflicts. But perhaps this episode will mark the beginning of a new phase, a phase in which America will feel the consequences of its own economic aggression for the first time. And then the question will no longer be who is to blame, but who will pay. Because as usual, it will be ordinary Americans who will pay. When the news reported that Donald Trump was imposing a 10% tariff on Canadian goods, it looked like just another episode in the long series of trade conflicts that have accompanied his presidency. However, what initially appeared to be a routine political maneuver soon turned into a new wave of tension between the two countries, whose relationship had been considered a model of cooperation for decades. The decision came unexpectedly, just a few days after a political advertisement began airing on television in which supporters of an American foundation used footage of Ronald Reagan to contrast his policies with those of the current president. Where Reagan spoke of the strength of alliances, Trump saw a rebuke, almost a personal insult. And according to sources in the White House, it was this emotional background that became the starting point for the decision on tariffs.
Well, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney told reporters about a couple of hours ago his country is prepared to continue trade talks when the Americans are ready to actually return to discussions.
Behind this move, as with many of Trump's other decisions, was the logic of demonstrating strength. He wanted to show that the United States would not allow anyone, not even Canada, to use it as a tool in a political game. But in reality, the tariffs became more a symbol of irritation than a strategy. Washington understood perfectly well that Canada could not be perceived as an economic threat. The trade balance between the two countries has long been stable, and most of Canada's exports go to the US. Nevertheless, in an atmosphere of political rivalry, logic often gives way to emotion. Experts noted that at a time when the US economy was beginning to recover gradually from another recession, new tariffs could undermine investor confidence.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Canadian aluminum, wood, food products, and automotive components all formed the basis of American production chains. Now, however, each shipment of such goods was subject to an additional tax, which was intended to punish Canada but in fact hit Americans themselves. Just a week after the tariffs were announced, several large construction companies said they were forced to revise their budgets due to rising material costs. Representatives of the automotive industry warned that prices for parts manufactured in Ontario could rise by 15 to 20%. However, Trump was not bothered by this. His entourage claimed that short-term difficulties were an acceptable price to pay for restoring justice. According to the administration, justice meant that Canada was allegedly taking advantage of trade privileges, causing damage to American manufacturers. The problem was that there was no convincing evidence to support this. Even internal reports from the US Department of Commerce, later published in the press, showed that there were almost no real losses from Canadian imports, and that the introduction of tariffs could lead to inflation in the domestic market.
To pick up on that progress and build on that progress when the Americans are ready to have those discussions, because it will be for the benefit of workers in the United States, workers in Canada, and families in both of our countries.
The story also had symbolic undertones. Ronald Reagan, to whom the authors of The Commercial appealed, once said that America's real strength lies in its alliances. His era was associated with diplomacy, strategic partnerships, and global confidence. It was under Reagan that North American integration was strengthened, laying the foundation for the future NAFTA. He believed that economic interdependence between the US and Canada was a guarantee of stability for the entire continent. And now, as Trump deliberately dismantled this structure, many observers saw it not just as an economic move, but as an ideological break with the legacy of the past. In Canada, the news of the tariffs caused confusion and anger. The Prime Minister issued a harsh statement, calling the US decision a stab in the back. For several days, the Canadian media actively discussed what exactly had prompted this decision. Some journalists claimed that it all started with a phone call in which Trump abruptly interrupted his Canadian counterpart when he heard Reagan's name, Megan's. This episode has never been confirmed, but it fits perfectly into the overall picture: impulsive decisions born not in the offices of advisors, but in emotional outbursts.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
While Washington tried to justify the tariffs with rhetoric about national security, analysts in New York were already calculating the losses. The Industrial Confidence Index fell 2 points in just 1 week, and the stock market began to experience slight but noticeable turbulence. Several companies dependent on supplies from Canada reported a temporary suspension of contracts. In Detroit, the launch of a new production line was delayed, citing the unpredictability of component prices. It all looked like a quiet economic fire that started from a single political spark. Interestingly, even within the Republican Party, many viewed the tariffs with bewilderment. Several senators known for their commitment to free trade said in private conversations that the White House's policy was turning friends into enemies. One of Reagan's former advisors, speaking on CNN, said that Reagan, if he were alive, would not understand how America came to punish Canada. This phrase quickly spread across social media and became a kind of meme, symbolizing the moral gap between the past and the present.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
But perhaps the main irony was that even the White House itself soon felt the consequences of its own decision. Canada's retaliatory measures followed almost immediately: mirror tariffs, a review of quotas on American steel, and then statements of intent to seek new markets in Asia. Economists estimated that the US losses from Canada's retaliatory actions could exceed the benefits of the new tariffs in the first year alone. And yet Trump did not back down. At press conferences, he continued to talk about unfair treatment of American workers and restoring economic sovereignty. But behind these slogans lay the fact that, in reality, America was once again paying the price for its own policies. What Reagan considered fundamental, the trust of allies, market reliability, and predictability, was now crumbling before our eyes.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
If Reagan could have seen how the situation was developing, he would probably have been amazed. His strategy toward Canada and Mexico was always based on a balance of interests. He understood that the strength of the United States lay not only in its military or economy, but also in its ability to unite its neighbors. His era was a time when trade was seen as a means of strengthening peace. Trump, on the other hand, has turned trade into a weapon aimed at both partners and opponents. Thus, the 10% tariff on Canada was not just an economic move. It was an ideological gesture, a rejection of the principles on which American international authority had been built for decades. And, significantly, this gesture was born not out of cold calculation, but out of personal resentment turned into state policy. As a result, America, in its quest to show strength, only highlighted its own vulnerability, dependence on allies, internal contradictions, and growing public fatigue with endless economic clashes.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Looking back today, we can say that this moment was a turning point. It was then that the world clearly saw for the first time that the United States, once a symbol of stability and pragmatism, had begun to act not on the basis of national interests, but on the emotional impulses of its leader. And this is the most dangerous consequence of the whole story with tariffs and the dispute over Reagan's name. Because while Trump was proving his superiority, America was losing what Reagan once considered its main asset, the respect and trust of the world. After the announcement of tariffs against Canada, the American economy began to feel the consequences, which seemed insignificant at first, but gradually turned into systemic shocks. The decision, presented as a protection of the domestic market, unexpectedly hit that very market. Companies dependent on Canadian imports faced rising costs, and this increase quickly spread throughout the supply chain. Within a few weeks, aluminum prices rose by almost 12%. Construction companies began to complain about delays in timber deliveries, and beverage manufacturers complained about increases in the price of aluminum containers. It seemed that the 10% tariff had turned into a multi-layered domino effect, affecting even those industries that did not trade directly with Canada. American consumers were the first to feel the impact. Just a month after the tariffs were introduced, Bloomberg and Reuters began reporting on rising prices for household goods and electronic. Simple items such as refrigerators and cookware that used Canadian components rose in price by 8 to 10%. Against this backdrop, alarm bells began to ring in some states, especially Michigan and Ohio, as people lost their jobs at factories that were closely linked to the northern neighbor. The situation seemed paradoxical. The policy that promised to bring manufacturing back to America was beginning to destroy it.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Behind the scenes at the White House, economic advisors tried to smooth things over, assuring the president that the situation was temporary. But analysts were already warning that any trade war with Canada was not just a dispute over tariffs, but an intervention in the living organism of the North American economy. Canada was not a competitor, but a partner in the literal sense of the word. 75% of Canadian exports went to the US, and thousands of American businesses depended on reverse shipments. When this system failed, the effect was similar to a failure in the blood circulation. In some places, supplies stopped. In others, panic buying began, and in still others, speculation increased. Farmers were particularly hard hit. After the tariffs were introduced, Canada responded with mirror measures, imposing restrictions on imports of American agricultural products. Supplies of soybeans, apples, and corn were hit hard. For the Midwest, it was a blow to the heart. In Illinois and Iowa, farmers who had previously actively exported their crops to the north began to lose income. Several large processing companies announced staff cuts. Even in traditionally conservative circles, voices of discontent began to be heard. Local newspapers published stories of farmers forced to sell their equipment to cover their debts. One of them, in an interview with a regional publication, said something that quickly became symbolic of what was happening. "We are paying for a war that no one asked to start."
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Canada's trade retaliation measures turned out to be much tougher than expected. Tired of constant provocations, the country's government decided to act on the principle of symmetry, but in reality, each new measure was strategic in nature. Tariffs were imposed on American cars, agricultural products, beverages, and, most significantly, coal and steel. Canada did what even the US's European partners did not dare to do. It publicly announced that it would seek new allies in Asia. Ottawa began negotiations with Japan and South Korea on possible agreements that could partially replace the American market. This news came as a shock to Washington. After all, if Canada seriously began to redirect its exports elsewhere, America would lose not only money, but also control over its northern economic artery. The situation on the financial markets was also deteriorating. Investors sensitive to political instability began to withdraw capital from certain sectors related to foreign trade. The industrial companies index fell to its lowest level in 2 years. Bank analysts began to talk about a trade outflow, a phenomenon where companies lose their incentive to export and stop investing in expansion. All this was happening against the backdrop of public statements by the administration that America is winning. But the numbers told a different story.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Interestingly, the effect of tariffs was noticeable not only in the economy but also in the social sphere. Rising prices and job cuts deepened the divide in society. Some continued to support the president, believing that he was waging a sacred struggle for American manufacturing, while others saw it as a path to self-isolation. Posters with the slogan "Stop taxing your own people" appeared at protests in major cities. For the first time in a long time, the topic of international trade became the subject of everyday conversation in cafes, taxis, and factories. People who were far removed from the economy understood that something was wrong. In Canada, meanwhile, the opposite was happening. Despite temporary losses, society rallied around the idea of economic independence. Local manufacturers began to actively advertise products labeled "Made in Canada." Television campaigns appeared, urging Canadians to support their manufacturers, and stores began to change their assortment, reducing the share of American brands. In a matter of months, this turned into a cultural movement, a quiet economic nationalism born not of aggression, but of fatigue from American pressure.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
What was particularly painful for the US was that Canada found support from other countries. The European Union issued a statement on the unacceptability of unilateral tariffs, and some Asian countries offered Canada participation in alternative trade agreements. The media began to write about a new coalition of stability that could include countries tired of American unpredictability. It seemed almost symbolic America's allies were beginning to unite without it. Experts increasingly voiced the opinion that Trump, in seeking to punish Canada, had in fact given it a push toward economic maturity. A country that had long seen itself in the shadow of a giant suddenly realized that it was capable of surviving on its own. This psychological shift was perhaps the most dangerous for Washington. Trade disputes come and go, but lost connections and trust are much more difficult to restore.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, American corporations began to count their losses. Automakers reported a decline in domestic sales. Retailers faced a drop in demand. Even the technology sector, far removed from commodity disputes, felt the pressure. Rising material prices and declining consumer purchasing power hit the entire consumer segment. Some economists called what was happening a hidden recession. On the surface, the economy looked stable, but beneath the surface, a slow process of capital erosion was underway.